The man arrived at the cave on a January morning when the world had gone white and silent and still. He came on horseback, which was the only way a man could move through that particular depth of snow. And even the horse was struggling each step. A deliberate negotiation with the drifts that had buried the familiar landmarks of the valley under 4 feet of packed white. The rider's coat was crusted with ice along the collar and the sleeves. His hat had been pulled low against the cold until the brim touched the tops of his ears. His face, what could be seen of it, was the gray-white color of a man who had not slept in several days and had seen things in that time that had altered his understanding of the world. He stopped the horse at the entrance to the cave. The entrance was not obvious. It never had been. The rocky outcropping of the low mesa hid it from direct view until you were close enough to see the dark opening in the stone. And even then it seemed less like a door and more like a wound. A place where the mountain had split open and revealed something unexpected in its interior. But there was light coming from inside. A warm, amber, steady light that had no business existing in the face of that much cold and that much snow. And there was smoke, a thin thread of it rising from a narrow crack in the rock above the cave's entrance, climbing straight up in the still January air, in a way that smoke only climbs when it is moving through a channel, rather than drifting free. The man on horseback looked at the light. He looked at the smoke. He looked at the entrance for a long time without moving, his breath misting in the frozen air. The horse shifting its weight from hoof to hoof in the snow. A dog appeared at the entrance, a border collie gray around the muzzle now, who had aged in the way of good working dogs without losing the intelligence in her eyes or the alertness in her posture. She did not bark. She looked at the man on the horse with the specific attention of an animal that is evaluating whether a situation requires action. And then the woman appeared behind the dog. She was 62 years old, and she looked it not in the way of a woman who had been defeated by those years, but in the way of a woman who had lived through all of them without apology, who carried the evidence of her history in the lines of her face and the set of her shoulders and the particular stillness of her expression. Her hair had gone the color of iron. Her hands, where they rested at her sides, were the hands of someone who had worked outdoors through every season of every year. She stood in the entrance of the cave with the light behind her and the cold in front of her. And she looked at the man on the horse. His name was Silas Vance. He was 72 years old. He was one of the most powerful landowners in the Ridgewater Valley, a man who had owned more cattle than most ranchers could dream of, who had sat in the front pew of the church every Sunday for 40 years, who spoke and expected to be heard and generally was. He had a face built for command, strong-jawed and deliberate, with eyes that had always been accustomed to making assessments and having those assessments go unchallenged. He looked at the woman in the cave entrance and he said 3 words, "May we come here?" He said them the way a man says words that cost him everything remaining of what he thought he was. He said them quietly. The wind was not blowing that morning, which meant there was nothing to carry them away or soften their edges. They hung in the still January air between him and the woman he had last spoken to 8 months before, on the afternoon he had thrown money at her feet and told her to leave the only home she had known for 42 years. She did not answer immediately. She looked at him. She looked past him at the shapes of the others, the 22 people who had made the journey across the buried valley. Behind him, bundled in every layer of clothing they could find, some on horseback and some on foot, carrying children and helping the elderly through drifts that made every step a small battle. She looked at all of them, and then she looked at Silas Vance once more. This was not the story of how she came to be standing there in the entrance of a cave that everyone in Ridgewater had called worthless, watching the man who had destroyed her life arrive at her door in need of what she had built. That story had begun 8 months earlier in the spring of 1890, in the weeks after the ground had taken Robert Caldwell, and the family had assembled to determine what his absence meant for the disposition of his property. Robert had been a good man. This was not sentiment. It was the plain truth stated in the way of a woman who had spent 40 years beside him and had done so willingly, had chosen him against no opposition, and had never had cause to revise the wisdom of the choice. He had been a quiet man, the kind whose quality revealed itself gradually over time, rather than announcing itself in early impressions. And Nora had understood this about him from the beginning, and had valued it because she was similar in the relevant ways. They had built a life together that was not wealthy, but was solid. A working rancher's life in the Montana Valley that had asked hard things of both of them, and had given back what such lives give back, which was not ease, but the particular satisfaction of knowing that what you had was the direct result of what you had done. He had died in March. His lungs. The same wet winter that had worn down the cattle had found the weakness in a chest that had been coughing since December. And by the end of February, it was clear that the weakness was going to win. And by the middle of March, it had. He died on a Tuesday morning while the snow was still on the ground, with Nora beside him and her brother Owen at the foot of the bed. And he died without drama in the way of people who have spent their lives in a relationship with hard reality and have made their peace with it. The funeral was on a Thursday. The weather held. People came from across the valley and said the things people say, and Nora received them with the composure that the situation required, and that she had been preparing herself to provide for the 6 weeks since it became clear there would be a funeral to plan. Silas Vance had sat in the front pew. This was appropriate. He was Robert's older brother, the eldest of the Vance Caldwell family, the one who had stayed when the others had scattered or died or married away. His wife had died years before, and his children had moved east. He was the last of the older generation, the man who held the family's institutional memory, and as it turned out, the family's legal position on certain matters of inheritance. He came to the house on the Thursday after the funeral, not the day of which would have seemed indecent even to him. He waited the prescribed interval, and then he came on a fine spring afternoon when the mud was beginning to dry on the road and the creek was running high with snowmelt, and the world outside had the particular sharp brightness of Montana in late April. He had papers. He presented them at the kitchen table, laid out with the care of a man who had prepared for the meeting and intended for it to go in a specific direction. He explained the situation in the language of those papers, which was a dry and precise language, a language of estate and bequest and familial succession, that had the quality of all legal language, which was to say that it described human things in terms that made them sound like the movement of objects rather than the alteration of lives. The property, the house, the land, the livestock, the equipment, the structures had been held jointly in the names of Robert Caldwell and the Vance family, and upon the death of the primary holder, the interest reverted to the surviving family. This was the arrangement that had been in place since before Nora had entered the picture. It was not unusual. It was the kind of arrangement that had been made 100 times across 100 years of frontier land management, and no one had thought to revisit it because no one had needed to until now. The result was that Nora had no claim. The house was not hers. The land was not hers. The livestock and the equipment and everything she had helped to build and maintain across 4 decades of married life belonged by the terms of those papers to the surviving family, which at this point consisted of Silas Vance, who was sitting across the kitchen table from her with the papers laid out between them. Nora read the papers. She read them carefully and completely, the way she did everything with the full attention of a woman who did not like to be imprecise about things that mattered. She did not ask questions that were not necessary. The papers were what they said they were. She had known that such arrangements existed, and she had simply never had reason to examine how they applied to her specific situation, which was a failure of attention on her part, and not something she was inclined to blame on anyone else. When she had finished reading, she placed the papers back on the table and looked at Silas Vance. He had an envelope. He placed it beside the papers. Inside it were coins and folded bills. $35. He had made a calculation of what a woman in her circumstances could be expected to need to establish herself elsewhere to pay for a few months of room and board while she found work, or family, or whatever resource was available to her in the absence of the home she was leaving. And $35 had been the result of that calculation. He did not say this was a gift. He said it was appropriate to the situation. She did not touch the envelope. Owen was in the doorway. Her younger brother, 58 years old. A man who had been quiet for the past 4 months, in a way that went beyond personality into something deeper and less voluntary. His wife, Agnes, had died in January of the same wet winter that had taken Robert, and Owen had not spoken much since then. He had come to stay with Nora and Robert in February when it became clear he needed people around him, and he had been present and functional and utterly silent, moving through the days with the particular careful movements of a man who is still learning to carry a weight that is new to him. He stood in the doorway and looked at his sister and at Silas Vance and at the papers on the table, and did not say anything. But his eyes were steady on his sister's face. Nora stood up from the table. She did not take the envelope. She did not thank Silas Vance. She did not argue with him or plead with him or do any of the things that the situation might have seemed to invite. She simply stood up because there was nothing further to accomplish in that room. And she went to find her dog. Scout was on the porch. The border collie had been with Nora for 9 years since the winter. A neighboring rancher's dog had produced a litter and offered the pick to anyone who wanted one. She was graying around the muzzle now, but her eyes had the same intelligence. They had always had the capacity for reading situations that some dogs develop when they have spent years with the same person and have learned to calibrate their responses to that person's state with considerable accuracy. She looked at Nora when Nora came out onto the porch, and she got up without being told. They walked together off the porch and across the yard, the woman and the dog, into the late afternoon of an April day in Montana, when the mountains to the east were still white, but the valley floor had surrendered the last of its snow. Owen came behind them quietly, keeping a certain distance as if he understood that the moment required space around it. Behind them, in the house that was no longer their house, Silas Vance gathered his papers. The auction was held on a Thursday morning in May at the town hall of Ridgewater, which was also the county administrative office and the place where legal proceedings of various minor kinds were regularly conducted. It was a functional building without aspiration, wooden unpainted on the inside, with benches along the walls and a raised platform at the far end where the auctioneer stood and where the town's official business was performed. It smelled of pine resin and lamp oil, and the accumulated dry dust of a building that had been hosting the community's practical necessities for 20 years. Silas Vance was in the front row. He was there not because he had particular interest in any of the lots being auctioned, which were mostly tax seizures and abandoned claims and parcels of land that had defeated one owner after another, but because a man in his position attended these proceedings It was expected of him, and he expected it of himself. He sat with his hat in his lap and his back straight, and his expression carrying the mild attentiveness of a man who is present out of obligation rather than appetite. Nora sat in the back. She had Owen beside her and scouted her feet. The dog having refused to remain outside when she could be inside a preference Nora had stopped arguing against years before. She had the money. She had come with $20 drawn from the small account that had been in her name. A loan, a reserve she had maintained across the years of her marriage, against the possibility of needing resources that were not attached to the joint arrangements of the household. She had needed it now. The auctioneer was a heavy man who moved through his catalog with the professional efficiency of someone who has long since stopped finding the work interesting, but has not stopped doing it well. He called the lots in sequence, took the bids that came, marked the results, and moved on. The morning had the quality of mild collective tedium that such proceedings typically have, the sense of an official obligation being discharged by people who are present because it is necessary. Lot 17 was 160 acres in the limestone country north of town, on the far side of Copper Mesa land that had been known locally for the past 40 years as Hemlock's Folly, in reference to the prospector who had spent 15 years digging it for silver and found nothing. The parcel included the cave system that old Hemlock had spent his years in, and it had changed hands 3 times in the decades since his death, and each owner had walked away from it having found nothing to justify the effort. The auctioneer called it without enthusiasm. Starting bid $20. He looked around the room and received the silence that such parcels typically receive, the collective assessment of people who had been told 100 times over 40 years that this particular piece of ground was not worth the taxes. Then Nora raised her hand. The room turned toward her. She was small in the way of someone who has never been particularly large, dressed in a plain dark dress that had belonged to her mother, and that she wore without any signal that she was aware of its condition or its age. She was 62 years old, and she had the look of someone who had recently been through a significant loss, which she had. But the look she was wearing at this moment was not grief, and it was not desperation. It was the look of a woman who had made a calculation and was acting on it. A woman whose hand was up because she had decided it should be, and not for any reason she felt required explanation. The auctioneer said her name, said it in the slightly uncertain tone of someone confirming that what he was seeing was what it appeared to be. Nora said yes. She said it clearly in a voice that carried the length of the room without effort. From the front row, without turning around, Silas Vance went very still. The stillness of a man who has registered something unexpected and is processing it before he responds. Then, slowly, with the deliberateness of a man who is in control of himself, he turned in his seat and looked at her. There was a murmur through the room. Not loud, not hostile, more the sound of collective surprise, resolving itself into commentary, the small social processing that communities do when something unexpected occurs in a familiar setting. A woman at the end of a bench said something to the woman beside her. A man near the door laughed briefly. The kind of laugh that is about mild disbelief rather than cruelty. Someone near the front said it aloud. Said what everyone was thinking, which was, what kind of idea did she have for a cave and 160 acres of useless rock? Nora did not respond to this. She looked at the auctioneer with the patience of a woman who has decided what she intends to do and is waiting for the appropriate mechanism to allow her to do it. The gavel came down. The lot was hers. She walked it forward, counted out the coins and bills on the clerk's table. With the care of someone accounting for every dollar, took the deed when it was handed to her. folded it once and placed it in the pocket of her dress. She walked back through the room toward the door without looking at anyone in particular, which was different from looking at the floor. She was simply moving toward the next thing. Owen rose when she passed him and fell in beside her. Scout was already at the door. Behind her, she heard the room resuming its proceedings. The sound of the next lot being called the return to the ordinary business of a May morning. She heard beneath that the sound of Silas Vance's voice addressed to no one in particular, saying something about what she would find when the first winter hit that land. She did not pause. She had not expected anything different from him in 40 years, and she had not received it. And the continuity of this was neither a surprise nor a wound. It was simply the landscape of the situation, as much a fixed feature of her life as the mountains on the eastern horizon. She had bought the land. Now she needed to understand what she had bought. The walk to Hemlock's Folly took most of the morning. The road gave out a mile from town and became a track, and the track gave out another mile beyond that and became the suggestion of repeated passage through scrub country. The land rose toward the mesa in gentle undulations, pale limestone, pushing through the thin soil and formations that caught the morning light and threw it back in flat gray plains. There was nothing luxuriant about it, nothing that invited approach. It was the kind of landscape that communicated its demands before you were close enough to assess what it might offer in return. The cave entrance was at the base of the mesa. She had seen it once before, years ago, passing with Robert on a different errand, and she remembered it as a dark space in the rock, significant only because it was there. Now she stood in front of it with Owen at her side, and Scout already moving toward it with the curiosity of a dog encountering a new space. And she looked at it the way her mother had taught her to look at things, which was with the question in mind of what the thing was trying to tell her, rather than what she had come expecting to find. The opening was perhaps 20 feet wide at the base and 12 feet high at its apex. The rock around it had been worn smooth by a process that had nothing to do with the prospectors who had worked here, worn smooth by water and time, and the slow patience of geological process. Just inside the entrance, where the light from outside met the dark from within, she could see that the floor of the cave was relatively level. Not perfectly, not as a floor is level, but level in the way of a space that has been shaped over a very long period of time by forces that favored consistency. She went in. The air inside was cool, not the sharp cold of a northern exposure or a deep shade, but the specific temperate cool of a place that maintained its own climate, independent of the season outside the way. A root cellar maintains temperature, the way old stone maintains the memory of whatever warmth it absorbed across the centuries of its formation. She stood just inside the entrance and let her eyes adjust and listen to what the cave was doing. What the cave was doing was breathing. She could feel it on the back of her hand when she held it up, a faint movement of air that was not wind, not the draft that comes from pressure. Differential at an opening, but a slower, more deliberate movement. The movement of air that has found a path through rock and is following that path with the patient conviction of something that has been doing this since before anyone had a name for it. She looked up. High in the ceiling of the main chamber, where the limestone formed an irregular dome above the cave floor, there was a fissure, narrow, perhaps 6 inches across at its widest point, running diagonally through the rock toward the surface. She held the candle she had brought and watched the flame. The flame bent, not dramatically, not violently, but with intention, bending in the direction of the fissure, responding to the pull of a draft that was moving through the rock from somewhere above. She took the journal from her pack. It was a small book, leather covered, the leather gone soft and dark from years of handling. Her grandmother had kept it in Cornwall in the tin mine country of the southwest of England, where her family had lived for generations in the hills and the hard land above the Atlantic coast. Her grandmother had been the keeper of a particular kind of knowledge that her family had accumulated across those generations. Practical knowledge about stone and water and shelter and the management of underground spaces. Knowledge that had kept her family alive through winters and floods, and the various extremities that the Cornish coast delivered to people who had chosen to live on it. When her mother had come to America, she had brought the journal. When her mother had passed it to Nora, she had said without emphasis or ceremony that everything in it was true. Nora opened it to the section her mother had marked years ago with a strip of wool. The page was dense with her grandmother's handwriting, a cramped, purposeful hand that used the available space efficiently. There were diagrams in the margins, cross-sections of underground spaces, notations about temperature and air movement, a careful accounting of the principles by which a cave could be made habitable through human effort, applied in the right places. She found the passage she was looking for. Her grandmother had written about a specific configuration, a cave with a natural air passage connecting it to the surface above. And she had written about what such a configuration meant for the habitability of the space and for the management of a fire within it. She had used the word gift. She had written that a natural chimney was the mountain's own provision, the thing that made the difference between a space that could be lived in and a space that could not. Nora looked at the fissure. She looked back at the page. She was holding in her hands a description of the place where she was standing. Owen was behind her. He had followed her in and was standing near the entrance, his eyes moving through the cave with the slow, methodical attention that he brought to most things. The attention of a man who had worked with his hands his whole life and understood spaces in practical terms. He was not speaking. He had not spoken in any meaningful way since January, but his eyes were moving, and the movement of his eyes had the quality of engagement, rather than the quality of absence, the quality of a man who was taking things in, rather than waiting for them to pass. She read the passage aloud. She did it without planning to. She had the journal open and the words were there, and she read them into the cave's acoustic space. Her grandmother's words about stone and warmth, and the particular gift of a natural passage through rock, and the cave received them the way it received all sound, with a slight amplification and a clarity that made the words more present than they would have been in open air. Owen was still. He was listening. She could tell because the particular quality of his stillness changed when he listened, became more concentrated, more directed in a way that was different from his usual stillness, which was the stillness of a man who was somewhere inside himself and not entirely accessible. She closed the journal and looked at the cave and thought about what she had for $35 and what she needed to build. The answer to what she had was good stone, a natural ventilation system, relatively level floor in the main chamber, and the dimensions necessary for the kind of project she was planning. The answer to what she needed to build was going to take the rest of the spring and all of the summer and most of the fall, and it was going to require resources she did not have. She would need sheep, a small flock, the beginning of a breeding operation that could grow with the seasons. Sheep could survive on the scrub grass and rough forage of this kind of country, could provide wool and milk and eventually meat, and a flock that started small could become significant over time. The question was the initial cost. She had $15 remaining from the auction, $15 and a border collie and a brother who was not speaking, and a grandmother's journal. and 40 years of living in Montana, and 20 years before that of learning from a mother who had grown up knowing things about stone and water that most people in this valley had never thought to ask. She went back to town. The general store was on the main street, a wide-fronted building that served the community's practical needs with the comprehensive coverage that a single establishment in an isolated valley requires. Marcus Tully ran it, a practical man of middle age with a shopkeeper's professional neutrality. A man who knew everyone's business in the way of people who handle everyone's transactions, and has learned to deploy that knowledge judiciously. She needed a large barrel, the biggest available, and some lengths of tin sheeting. She had done the calculation, and the calculation was not comfortable. The barrel alone would cost more than half of what she had left. She was looking at the barrels when a voice spoke behind her. A woman's voice, measured and unhurried with the particular quality of someone who has made up her mind before beginning to speak. Harriet Dunmore was 66 years old, and she ran the dressmaking shop 2 doors down from the general store. She was a widow, had been for 15 years, and she had the quality that some women develop in widowhood. The quality of a person who has outlived the need to manage other people's perceptions and has arrived at a kind of simplicity in her dealings with the world. She had silver hair and steady eyes, and she had known Nora Caldwell for 20 years, in the casual way of 2 women, in a small valley who have no particular bond, but no particular division either. She told Marcus Tully to put it on her account. Nora started to speak. Harriet held up a hand. She said that Robert Caldwell had done her family a service years ago, before Nora would have known about it, and that she had never found the right occasion to acknowledge it. She said that this seemed like the right occasion. She said it simply and without ceremony, as a person states something that has been true for a while and can now finally be said. She left before Nora could formulate a response. She simply turned and walked out back toward her shop, leaving Nora standing in the general store, with the barrel arranged and Marcus Tully looking at her with the slightly calculating expression of a man who is rapidly revising his assessment of a situation. 3 days later, Duncan Ferris came to the cave. He was 80 years old, and he had been in Montana for 50 of those years. A Scottish immigrant who had come west with nothing and had made himself useful, and eventually indispensable to several generations of ranchers who valued his knowledge of the land and his willingness to work. He had a face that was more wrinkled than skin at this point, and hands that were permanently bent from decades of cold and rope work, and he moved slowly. But he moved deliberately with the patience of a man who knows that speed is a young person's luxury and accuracy is the thing that matters. He had heard about the cave. Everyone in Ridgewater had heard about the cave by this point, or rather about the woman who had bought it, which was the same thing in the town's current understanding of the situation. He came out the track one afternoon in late May with a small pack and a walking staff, and he looked at what Nora had done in the first 3 weeks. She had begun the sheep pen already rough, but functional, using timber she had hauled from a stand of pine 3 miles distant. She had the beginning of the water collection system marked out on the interior wall where the limestone had the quality her grandmother's journal described, the slightly porous quality of stone that absorbs moisture and releases it under the right conditions. She had the barrel in position. She had spent 2 days studying the natural fissure in the ceiling and the diagrams in the journal, and had begun to understand the relationship between the two. Duncan walked through the space without speaking. He looked at the sheep pen and examined the joinery with one bent finger. He looked at the water wall and traced the marks she had made with a piece of charcoal to indicate where the collection gutters would go. He climbed the rough ladder she had built to look at the fissure from closer range. Then he came down and looked at her. He asked who had taught her this. She told him. Her mother. And her mother's mother, whose journal she was working from. A woman from Cornwall who had known how to read stone. He nodded. It was a slow nod. The nod of a man recognizing something he knew from a long time ago. From a place that was not this place, but that shared something essential with it. He said he had seen these methods in the Highlands when he was young. Families who had survived in stone houses and managed underground water sources and used the natural features of the landscape with a thoroughness that people who had not seen it described as impossible. He said they had laughed at those families too. He reached into his pack and took out a small leather pouch tied at the neck. He said these were seeds-hardy varieties that had been bred for thin soil and short-growing seasons varieties that a woman trying to establish a garden in limestone country would want to have. He said he had brought them because he suspected they would be needed. He pressed the pouch into her hands and walked away down the track toward town, not waiting for her response in the manner of people who give things without wanting the exchange complicated by gratitude. Nora stood at the cave entrance and watched him go, in her hand the pouch of seeds. Behind her, the cave. Somewhere in the valley below in the house she had lived in for 40 years, Silas Vance was managing the disposition of her former life. She turned back to the work. Owen was inside doing what he had been doing all week, which was carrying the cut timber lengths from the pile outside to the marked positions on the cave floor, placing them with the care of someone who is not certain of the plan, but trusts the person executing it. He did not ask questions. He did not offer opinions. He worked with the focused steadiness of a man who needs to be occupied and has found occupation, and is grateful for it in the way of people who are not yet able to be grateful for anything else. She came in and went to the water wall and ran her hand along the surface of the limestone. It was cool as it always was, and slightly rough in the way of old stone, and in the places where the wall's internal moisture was closest to the surface, she could feel the faint give of dampness beneath the palm, the stone breathing the water inside it close to release. She opened the journal to her grandmother's description of the limestone wall and the collection system, and she read it again, not because she did not know it, but because she was in the habit of returning to the source when she was about to begin a significant piece of work. The habit of a woman who respected the knowledge she had been given enough to verify it against its origin, rather than relying on her own recollection of it. The journal was specific and practical. Her grandmother had been that kind of woman, a woman who believed that knowledge was worth keeping only if it was accurate, only if it contained the precise detail that allowed another person to use it. The diagrams were exact. The descriptions of material were exact. The descriptions of method were exact. She had not written about her feelings or her fears or the larger significance of what she was preserving. She had written about how to do things clearly and completely, as if she understood that the how was the thing that would matter when her granddaughter needed it, which was what had turned out to be true. Nora read the passage about the limestone wall. Then she picked up her hammer and her nails and began to build the gutter system that would catch what the stone offered. Owen came to stand near her as she worked. He handed her things. He held things in place. He did not speak. The cave received them both, the woman and her brother, in the cool and the quiet that it had been maintaining for longer than either of them had been alive. It did not know what they needed from it. It simply continued to be what it was, which was stone and depth, and the steady cool of the earth and the patient potential of a place that had been waiting for someone to understand what it could give. The sheep arrived in June. She had found them through a rancher named Aldous, who operated a small spread 20 miles south of Ridgewater. and who had more animals than his pastures could comfortably support going into the summer. He was a practical man who asked practical questions, and when she told him she was establishing a flock in a cave system north of town, he looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone deciding whether to pursue that particular line of inquiry. And then he decided against it and named his price, which was fair. She drove them back herself, 10 sheep a mix of ewes and 1 ram, with Scout working the edges of the group with the professional competence of a dog that has found the work she was made for. Owen walked on the other side, filling the gap that the formation needed, keeping the animals on the track through the limestone country, with the quiet effectiveness of a man who had worked with livestock his whole life, and whose body remembered what his voice was not currently contributing. They moved as a small, purposeful unit through the dry June afternoon. 3 of them engaged in a task that had its own logic and its own satisfactions, and for those hours the larger considerations were set aside in favor of the immediate requirements of moving 10 animals across uneven ground. The cave received the sheep the way it had received everything else, without comment, with the specific quality of a space that has been existing for a very long time and regards new occupants with the patience of something that knows it will outlast them all. The animals moved into the enclosure Nora had built and stood together in the way of sheep in a new space, assessing, adjusting, gradually settling into the stillness of creatures who have determined that the immediate situation does not require alarm. The temperature in the cave was cooler than the June afternoon outside, and the sheep oriented toward this fact, with the unself-conscious practicality of animals making the best available choice. Nora stood in the cave and looked at them. 10 animals. The beginning of something that could become sufficient over time if the time was managed correctly and the work was done, and the winter that was coming was survivable. She thought about her grandmother, who had managed livestock in underground spaces in Cornwall, in the old tin mine country. And she thought about the journal and the specific pages that addressed the management of animals in enclosed spaces, the ventilation requirements, and the drainage requirements, and the particular considerations of keeping living things warm and healthy in a place where the usual cues of the natural world, the light and the wind and the seasonal temperature shifts, were replaced by the artificial consistency of stone and depth. She got the journal and went over those pages again, not for the first time, reading her grandmother's notes with the attention she would have given to instructions for something she had never done before, because she had never done this before. 40 years of ranching in Montana had given her the general knowledge of what animals needed and how to provide it. The specific knowledge of how to provide it in a limestone cave was in the journal, and she read the journal, and then she looked at the space, and then she read it again. Owen came to stand beside her while she read. He looked at the pages she was looking at, and she tilted the journal slightly so he could see more clearly. Not as a deliberate gesture, but as the natural accommodation of 2 people who have spent their whole lives in proximity and have worked out the small physical adjustments of shared attention. He read. She read. The sheep behind them made the small sounds of animals settling. The summer was the hardest physical work of Nora's life, and she had worked hard for 62 years, which was a field of comparison that made the statement mean something. She was building 4 things simultaneously, and each one of them demanded the kind of labor that would have taxed a younger woman working under better circumstances. The sheep pen already framed needed its permanent walls. The fitted limestone blocks that she was cutting and hauling from the scree field above the mesa, selecting each piece for size and shape and mortaring them with the clay. She was digging from the seam in the ravine below, and carrying up in buckets because the terrain between the ravine and the cave mouth allowed no other method of transport. The water collection system on the weeping wall needed its gutter structure complete, and its barrel integration and the careful sealing of every joint that would lose her precious moisture if she allowed gaps. The cabin needed to go up inside the cave's main chamber, a small structure of timber and clay that would hold warmth against the cold that was coming. And the cabin needed a stove, and the stove needed to connect to the natural fissure in the ceiling, which was the most technically demanding part of the whole enterprise, and the part that kept her up at night, with the journal open on her knee, trying to understand her grandmother's notes about the draw of air through rock and the angle of connection that would let smoke leave a fire without filling the space around it. Owen carried. He carried everything that needed to be carried from the ravine to the cave, from the timber stand to the cave, from the stone field to the cave. Day after day through the summer heat that turned the limestone country into a landscape of reflected brilliance and hard shadow. He had not spoken, but he had not been absent. There was a difference, and the difference was growing over the weeks. When she needed something, she did not have to ask for it, not because he was reading her mind, but because he had learned the work well enough to anticipate the sequence, to know what came next in the building process, and to have the next thing ready before she had finished the current thing. She watched this happening. She did not comment on it because she understood that calling attention to it would put it back in the realm of deliberate choice. And what she was watching was something that was happening below the level of deliberate choice, something that the work itself was doing to him by requiring his full attention and giving him in return the particular relief of a task that absorbs everything. The sheep pen walls were done by the end of June. They were solid stone on stone, fitted with the careful attention she had brought to everything in this place, and when she pressed her palm against them, they communicated the specific satisfaction of a well-made thing, the dense, unyielding quality of stone laid properly. She had built from her grandmother's drawings and from her own understanding of what the animals would need, which was warmth and drainage and a surface underfoot that could be maintained. And she had gotten it right on the first attempt, because she had prepared to get it right and had not allowed herself to proceed until she understood what she was doing. The gutter system on the limestone wall took 2 weeks to complete. She worked it in sections, attaching the split timber gutters to the wall at the angles her grandmother had specified, bridging the gaps with the tin sheeting from the general store that Harriet Dunmore had paid for testing each section, before attaching the next by running a small amount of water along the channel to verify the angle and the flow. The barrel at the bottom of the system was the result, the place where everything the wall offered would eventually accumulate. On the third morning after the system was complete, she heard it. A single drop falling from the end of the lowest gutter into the barrel. One drop in the particular silence of the deep cave, where the only sounds were the animals and the distant murmur of her and Owen's daily work. She heard it, and she stopped what she was doing and stood still and waited for the next one. It came, then another, then a small, steady sequence, not fast, nothing like the flow of a faucet or a spring, but regular, a rhythm. The limestone wall releasing what it had been holding in its porous interior and sending it along the path she had made for it. She went to the barrel and looked in and saw the small, bright pool at the bottom, an inch of water that had not been there yesterday, growing by one small drop at a time, with the patient indifference of a geological process that does not care whether anyone is watching. She laughed. It was a laugh of release as much as pleasure, the laugh of a woman who has committed to a belief and been confirmed in it, who has staked something on what she was taught and been told by the result that what she was taught was true. It came out of her without preparation, and it echoed in the cave in a way that startled the sheep and caused Scout to lift her head from the floor and look at her with the mild inquiry of a dog evaluating an unusual sound. Behind her, Owen was standing near the sheep pen wall with a bucket in his hand. She heard the sound he made, and she turned. He was smiling. It was not the full laugh of a man at ease, not the uninhibited response of someone who has forgotten their grief, but it was real. The corners of his mouth had moved, and his eyes had changed quality, and the smile, small as it was the first genuine expression of anything other than quiet endurance that she had seen on his face since January. She looked at him, and she did not say anything about it. She turned back to the barrel and the dripping wall, and she said more to the cave than to him that the old woman had been right about the stone. And Owen made a sound that was not quite a word, but was not quite only breath either. A sound of agreement, and then he picked his bucket back up and went back to his work. The cabin went up in July. She had laid out the dimensions on the cave floor in charcoal, using the proportions her grandmother had recommended for a single-room structure in an underground space 12 feet by 10, with the long axis running parallel to the cave wall, so that the rear wall of the cabin could share the thermal mass of the stone behind it. She built the walls from split timber, mortared with clay, the clay she had been digging and carrying and mixing all summer. And the walls went up slowly. But they went up true, each log assessed before it was placed, each joint sealed before the next course was laid. The stove was the final piece. She spent 3 days building it using clay and stone, working from her grandmother's diagram of a retained heat chamber, with particular attention to the throat of the connection between the stove body and the pipe she was building to reach the fissure. She had cut the tin sheeting into sections and hammered them into cylinders overlapping the joins and sealing them with wet clay. And she had built the scaffold of lashed timber to hold the pipe sections in alignment as she assembled them upward toward the crack in the ceiling. The scaffold was rickety in the way of structures built by one person with insufficient materials, and she climbed it with the care and the focused attention of a woman who is very aware that a fall in this location would be a serious problem. The connection took most of the 3rd day. She was working at height with the pipe section in her hands and the fissure close enough to touch, trying to align the end of the pipe with the opening in the rock so that the seal would hold and the draw would work. Owen held the base of the scaffold and did not look up, which was the most useful thing he could do. She felt the pipe seat in the fissure and held it there, and pressed the clay around the joint with her fingers, and held that, and then let go, and the pipe stayed. She climbed down. She built a small fire in the stove, a test fire, a handful of wood shavings, and a few small splits of dry timber. The fire caught. She watched the smoke. The smoke rose from the fire and found the opening of the pipe and traveled upward, through the tin, through the clay joint, through the fissure in the rock, through 20 feet of limestone, and emerged somewhere on the surface of the mesa above them, invisible, untraceable, the ghost of a fire that had no business being underground. The cave stayed clean. Not a trace of smoke in the air she was breathing. The heat from the small fire began to move outward into the space around it, gentle and steady. The heat of a contained fire rather than an open one. She sat down on the cave floor beside the stove and put her face in her hands for a moment, not from despair, from the specific release of a tension that has been maintained for so long that the body does not know what to do with its absence. 3 months of work had been building toward this moment, the moment when the systems she had constructed were all functioning, when the cave was no longer just a cave, but a place that could sustain life through a Montana winter. And the moment of proof, the clean air and the rising smoke and the warmth beginning to move through the space. had taken something out of her that she had not known she was still holding. Owen sat down beside her. Not close, but beside her within the radius of presence. They stayed like that for a while in the cave that was now something other than a cave. The first frost came in early September. She saw it on the scrub brush outside the entrance, the fine silver lace of the season's first announcement. And she looked at it and thought about what was coming and went inside to review her preparations and find the things that were not yet sufficient and address them. There were always things that were not yet sufficient. This was not a failure of the work. It was the nature of preparation, which is a continuous process, rather than a completed state. A process that ends only when the thing you were preparing for arrives, and you can finally assess the gap between what you had and what you needed. She moved through the list methodically, adding to the firewood supply that she had been building since August, carrying load after load from the timber stand and stacking it inside the cave, where the dry air would reduce whatever moisture the wood still held. She reinforced the sheep pen door, which had shown some looseness in its hanging that would become a problem in hard cold. She checked the gutter system and tightened the joints that the summer's heat and drying had slightly opened. It was while she was checking the sheep pen that she found the fence. 2 sections of the pen wall on the far side where it abutted the cave's natural rock had been cut clean through. Not broken, not fallen, but cut with a tool that had been applied deliberately and with some force to the lashing that held the pen's outer boards in place. The cuts were clean and the angle was deliberate. Someone had come to the cave in the night and had used a knife or a small saw to sever the connections that held the pen together, and had done so with enough care to avoid disturbing the animals enough to raise any alarm. 2 of the sheep had gotten through the gap in the night and were somewhere in the cave or beyond it. Scout had them, she discovered, herded into the corner of the main chamber with the methodical patience of a dog who has found a problem and solved it while everyone else was sleeping. Nora stood in the damaged section of the pen and looked at the cuts. She looked at them for a long time. The quality of the work, the clean angle of the cuts, the specific placement on the lashing, rather than the boards themselves, told her something about the intention behind it. This was not the vandalism of someone who wanted to make a mess. This was the work of someone who wanted the animals to get out to wander off to create enough of a problem that the morning would be consumed by damage control rather than by productive work. She thought about who in the Ridgewater Valley would have both the motive and the willingness for that kind of action. She did not allow herself to stay in that thought for long. It was not useful. The names that presented themselves to her as possible sources were names she could not act on without evidence, and she had work to do. And a winter coming and the energy spent in anger about what she could not change was energy not available for what she needed to do. She repaired the pen. She used longer lashings, double wrapped, and added a second layer of boarding at the vulnerable section, and she drove additional stakes into the cave floor along the outer wall to create a physical barrier that was harder to access quietly. Then she went about the rest of the morning's work. She did not tell Owen. She did not want him to spend his energy on it either. October was preparation relentless and focused. She added to the wood stack. She laid in the stores she had been building since the summer. The dried provisions and the preserved food, and the grain for the animals. And she placed them with the organization of someone who knows. She will need to find things in the dark and under pressure, and arranges them accordingly. She checked every system again and found 3 small corrections to make and made them. Duncan Ferris came to the cave in the 2nd week of October. He walked up the track in the gray afternoon and stood at the entrance and looked at the smoke still rising from the crack in the mesa above. And then he looked at her and he asked if she had been watching the sky. She had been watching the sky. She watched it every morning and every evening. And what she was seeing was what he was seeing, which was a quality she had no single word for, but that her body recognized without her mind needing to name it. A heaviness in the air, a specific quality of the light, an alteration in the behavior of the animals, both wild and domestic, that was different from the ordinary preparation of fall, and was more like the preparation for a particular kind of winter, the kind that does not moderate. He told her about the winter of 1830. He had been a child in Scotland, had survived it with his family in a stone farmhouse in the Highlands, and he described it the way people describe things they have not forgotten, because forgetting was not available to them. He said the sky had looked exactly like this. He said the animals had left the high ground a full month before the snows. He said the pressure in the air, the ache in the ears that she might be feeling was a sign he had read twice in his life, and each time it had meant the same thing. He said to be ready. She was already doing everything she could think of to be ready. When he left, she went inside and went through the list again, looking for what she might have missed. And she found 2 things and attended to them that afternoon. November arrived with a cold that was not quite the killing cold, but was its advance. Its announcement, the weather of a season that knows what it is capable of, and is not rushing because it does not need to. The scrub brush turned brown, and the creek at the foot of the valley ran slower, and the sky moved through the colors of approach without yet committing to the thing it was approaching. She was outside the cave entrance on an evening in mid-November when Scout went rigid. The dog's posture changed so completely and so suddenly that it was like watching one animal replaced by another. The relaxed border collie, who had been lying in the dust near the entrance, became in an instant a dog whose every muscle was engaged, whose attention had narrowed to a single point in the direction of the lower scree field. The hackles went up. The body lowered. Scout did not make a sound. She simply became the thing she became when the thing she was watching required it. Nora turned. The cougar was at the edge of the scree where the loose rock met the scrubby vegetation below. It was large, lean in the way of predators in late autumn, and its attention was on the cave entrance in a way that communicated not curiosity but calculation, the kind of attention that assesses distances and obstacles, and the location of prey. Her rifle was inside the cabin. She had left it there this morning when she went to check the animals and had not brought it back out, which was a failure of habit she would not repeat. She could go for it, but going for it meant crossing the space between herself and the entrance, which was the space the cougar was watching. And she was not fast enough to change the terms of that equation in her favor. She needed another option. She thought about the journal. Her grandmother had written extensively about predators in the tin mine country of Cornwall, had written about the specific vulnerabilities of enclosed spaces when wild animals were drawn by the smell of domestic animals, and had described methods for discouraging approach that relied on what the stone could do. The acoustic properties of limestone, the way the cave amplified and distributed sound, had been part of those methods. The journal had not described this specific situation. The journal had given her principles, and she needed to derive the application herself. She took the 2 iron implements that were leaning against the cave wall beside her, a heavy skillet and a metal pot thing she had brought out to rinse at the water barrel, and had set against the wall while she watched the sunset. She moved away from the entrance, away from the cougar, deeper into the cave's main chamber, and she swung the skillet against the pot. The sound in the cave was extraordinary, not merely loud, though it was very loud, but distributed, reflected, amplified, and re-amplified by the limestone walls, until it seemed to come from everywhere, simultaneously, a percussive chaos that had no source point and no endpoint, and no relationship to any sound that would be associated with a natural or navigable situation. It was the sound of the mountain having an argument with itself. Scout began to bark. Her barking was added to the sound and also amplified, turned into something larger and less dog-specific than actual barking. Nora kept going. She moved through the space, striking the metal against the metal, changing her position, using the cave's geometry to maximize the distribution of the sound. And the cave did what she had believed it would do, because the journal said it would do it, which was take the human-made sound and make it something inhuman and pervasive and impossible to locate or categorize. She did not see the cougar leave. When she went to the entrance, the scree field was empty. Scout was still at the edge of the entrance, hackles still up, but the absolute rigidity was gone, replaced by the aftermath posture of a dog who has been on full alert and is slowly releasing it. Nora stood in the entrance with the skillet still in her hand and looked at the empty scree and breathed. She looked at her hand. It was trembling slightly, not from fear she had passed through. Fear and out the other side, but from the specific physical residue of sustained tension. She looked at the skillet, and she thought about what had just happened, which was that she had faced a situation for which her grandmother's journal had no explicit instructions, and she had drawn on the principles in the journal to derive a solution she had not been taught. She had not followed her grandmother's recipe. She had used her grandmother's understanding and applied it to a problem her grandmother had not specifically addressed. The distinction felt important in a way she did not immediately have words for. Behind her, Owen was standing near the pen where the sheep had crowded together at the sound. His expression was different from the expressions she was used to seeing on his face. It was present, fully present, with none of the clouded quality that had characterized his face since January. And it was animated by something she recognized after a moment as amusement. The complicated amusement of a person who has just witnessed something simultaneously alarming and precisely effective, and cannot quite decide which quality deserves the primary response. He laughed. It was a real laugh. The first real laugh she had heard from him in 10 months. A laugh that came from somewhere genuine, that made the sound of a man who has found something actually funny, rather than a man who is performing the memory of humor. Scout looked at him, confused by the sudden shift in register. The sheep looked at him. Nora looked at him. She started laughing too. She stood in the cave entrance with the skillet in her hand, and she laughed and Owen laughed, and the cave sent both sounds back at them in the particular way it handled. All sound a little larger than the original, a little more present. The stone adding its own quality to what the humans had put in. The first real snow came in the last week of November. Not the storm yet, not the thing Duncan had warned her about, but its predecessor, a snowfall of ordinary scale that covered the landscape outside the cave entrance and changed the color of the world from the tawny browns and pale grays of late autumn to the white that would now be the dominant color for months. She watched it from the entrance with Scout beside her and felt the stillness in the air and thought about the stores inside and about the systems she had built and about whether they were adequate. The snow continued through December. Cold settled into the valley like something taking up residence. She watched the thermometer she had hung inside the cave entrance and watched the temperature outside drop day by day with the inexorable patience of a process that has no awareness of what it costs and no interest in what it answers to. She kept the cabin warm and the sheep warm and the water system functioning, and she worked through every day with the focused attention of a woman who knows that the margin between adequate and inadequate is being tested continuously, and that the test is not theoretical. She read the journal in the evenings. She had been reading it since the summer. But the reading had a different quality. Now had the quality of conversation. Rather than study, the quality of returning to a familiar voice that had something new to offer each time she came back to it. It because she was coming to it as a different person than she had been the time before. She read about her grandmother's winters in Cornwall and about the methods that had kept her family alive through storms that were in some ways worse than what Montana could offer, and in some ways not, and she found in the reading both information and companionship. The companionship of a woman who had faced hard things and had written down what she learned not for posterity, but for the specific granddaughter who was going to need it. The big storm arrived on the 19th of December. It did not arrive gradually. It arrived as storms arrive when they have been gathering force over a great distance and have saved that force for the moment of delivery. The snow came down with a density that was not weather in any ordinary sense, but was the closest thing to a physical force that weather could achieve. And the wind that drove it was not wind as a familiar thing, but as a thing that had decided to remove all distinction between the air and the ground and the sky and anything that was standing between them. The temperature dropped through the night of the 19th to a number that the thermometer could not adequately register, and stopped being informative about and stayed there. She sealed the entrance. She had prepared a wooden barrier for this, a heavy fitted piece she had built to block the lower half of the cave's opening, while still allowing the ventilation to function. And she dropped it into its fittings and felt the immediate change in the character of the air inside. The way the stone took over from the weather. The way the cold that was killing everything outside became a cold that was not quite warm inside, but was not the killing cold either. Was the cold of deep stone that has absorbed heat for millions of years and will not surrender it for the sake of one bad winter. The sheep huddled. The stove burned. The water dripped. She and Owen settled into the rhythm of the siege. She did not think of it as a siege. She thought of it as a different kind of management problem. A problem that required different tools than the construction phase had required, but was still fundamentally a problem of resources and time, and the application of knowledge to specific conditions. She managed the firewood against the duration she was estimating. She managed the food supply against the needs of 2 people and 10 animals. She managed the water system against the possibility of the limestone wall's moisture slowing an extreme cold, which her grandmother's journal addressed, and which had not yet become a problem, but which she watched. The days lost their distinction from each other. The difference between day and night inside the cave was a matter of lamp oil rather than light. The difference between the lamp being lit and the lamp being out. She kept to a schedule not because schedules had social meaning in this context, but because schedules were a form of management, a way of ensuring that the necessary things were done, and that the hours were not lost to the particular formlessness that can settle over confined time. Owen kept to the schedule too. He was more present now than he had been at any point since January, more available to the current moment. And she did not examine this too directly, because examination can change the thing being examined. But she noticed it and she was grateful for it. In the quiet way, she was grateful for things she could not have made happen by effort. On the 5th night of the storm, the 20th of December, one of the ewes showed signs of distress. She caught it early, which was the result of the regular checks on the animals that the schedule required, and that she did not skip, because the schedule was the schedule. The ewe was standing slightly apart from the others, and her posture had the particular quality of an animal that is not well, a quality she had been able to read in sheep since childhood. She went to the journal. She went to the sections about animal health in enclosed spaces in winter, which were extensive. her grandmother having managed animals through several significant Cornish winters. She read carefully, looking for what the symptoms she was seeing could indicate, what the treatments were, what the prognosis was for each possibility. The journal did not give her a clear answer. The symptoms she was looking at were consistent with several different conditions, some minor and some not. And the journal was honest about this ambiguity rather than pretending to certainty it did not have. Her grandmother had written that in cases of this kind, the judgment of the person present was the primary tool, and that the journal could provide context, but could not provide the judgment that came from being there. She sat on the floor of the cave beside the ewe and looked at her for a long time. She had been here before she realized. Not with this ewe, not in this cave, but in this situation. The situation of looking at a problem for which the accumulated wisdom she had been given did not have a complete answer, and needing to decide anyway. She had been here with the cougar, and she had found the answer in the principles rather than the instructions, had derived what she needed from what she understood, rather than from what she had been told. This was another version of the same thing. She needed to look at what she had in front of her and think about what she knew and make the judgment call and act on it. She looked at the ewe. She thought about what she knew. She made a decision, and she began to act on it, moving quietly and deliberately, working by the low light of the cave, with the focused attention of someone doing what the situation requires. Owen was awake. She had not realized he was awake until she heard him move. He came to stand near her without being asked, and he held the lantern at the angle she needed without being told. He had read the situation and responded to it in the way he had been responding to situations all summer and fall, with the competence of someone who understood the work even when he was not speaking. She worked for 2 hours. The ewe eventually settled. By the early hours of the morning, the distress signs had eased, and the animal was standing in a way that was no longer the way of an animal in trouble. She sat back on her heels and breathed out. The lamp was burning low. The stove was putting out its steady heat. Outside, the storm continued its 7th day, as if it had no interest in the question of when it might end. She was looking at the lamp when Owen sat down beside her, not near her. Beside her, within the specific proximity that means something that is close enough to communicate presence as a deliberate choice, rather than an incidental fact. The cave was quiet except for the sound of the animals and the distant, muffled roar of the storm. She said into the quiet that she was not sure she was doing this right. She said it not as a request for reassurance, but as a statement of the state of things. The honest acknowledgement of a woman who is 70% through something very hard, and has just come through a moment that revealed the limit of what she had been given by way of guidance. Owen was quiet for a moment, the length of a breath, 2 breaths. Then he said her name. She turned to look at him. His eyes were on her, not the eyes she had been looking at all year, but the eyes of a man who was present in body, but not quiet in the room. These were his real eyes. The eyes she had known her whole life. The eyes of her brother who had always been quiet, but had always been there. He said, "You know what to do. You always did." His voice was rough from disuse, the voice of a door that has been closed for a long time, the specific quality of a sound that is being made for the first time in too long. But it was his voice. It was Owen. He was in the room. She looked at him. She could not speak for a moment, not from grief and not from joy exactly, but from the particular quality of relief that comes when something you have been holding the space open for finally arrives to fill it, when the absence that you have been living alongside resolves back into presence, and the world is not better for it, in any dramatic sense. Only correct, only the way it should be, only right. She put her hand on his arm. They sat together in the fifth night of the worst storm Montana had seen in 40 years, in a cave that everyone had said was worthless in the warmth of a fire that was exhausting its smoke through 20 feet of limestone to emerge invisible on a mesa surface, buried under 4 feet of snow. The storm continued. But it continued differently now, because now there were 2 of them in the room. The storm ended on the 7th day. It did not end gradually. The way most storms end, with a slow diminishment of wind and a thinning of snowfall, and a gradual reassertion of the world beneath the white. It ended abruptly the way it had begun, as if whatever force had been driving it had simply made a decision and moved on. 1 hour. It was still roaring against the mesa above them, still pressing its weight against the sealed entrance, with the persistence of something that has made its intentions clear. The next hour, the sound was gone, and in its place was the specific silence of a landscape that has been rearranged. She knew it had ended before she opened the entrance. She knew it from the quality of the sound, from the absence of the low, continuous vibration that the wind had been transmitting through the rock for a week, and from Scout, who had been lying near the entrance barrier with the posture of an animal, tolerating a situation rather than responding to a threat, and who now stood up and moved to the entrance and waited there with the posture of a dog who wants to be let out. She lifted the barrier. The cold that came through the opening was the cold of absolute stillness, a different quality from the violent cold of the storm. The violent cold had been the cold of something in motion. This was the cold of something at rest, the cold of a landscape that has received everything that was being given to it and is now simply existing in the aftermath, holding its new shape, waiting to see what happened next. She stood in the entrance and looked. The valley below was unrecognizable. The features she had memorized over the months, the creek line and the road and the fence rows, and the dark lines of timber had been erased. What remained was a continuous white surface that ran from the base of the mesa to the far ridgeline, without interruption, interrupted only where the geometry of the land was dramatic enough to have resisted the accumulation, and even those places were softened. Rounded, the familiar angularity of the Montana landscape replaced by the smooth shapes that deep snow makes when it has had enough time to settle and consolidate. The temperature was cold beyond the language of cold. It was the kind of cold that operates below the ordinary register of cold, the kind that the body does not interpret as sensation, but as warning that communicates not discomfort, but the specific information that exposure to this air for any sustained period would be a decision with permanent consequences. She went back inside and began to think about what was out there. Ridgewater was 3 miles from the cave, 3 miles of valley floor under 4 or more feet of consolidated snow with whatever drifting the 7 days of wind had added on top of that. 3 miles of a terrain she had walked in clear weather in under an hour, which in these conditions would be a different kind of journey entirely. She thought about the families in town, about their stores and their structures, and the particular vulnerability of wood frame buildings under this kind of snow load. She thought about the ranches in the valley and the cattle that had been in the fields when the storm came. She thought about Duncan Ferris, who was 80 years old and lived alone on the east side of town. She thought about Harriet Dunmore. She thought about these things, and she made a fire in the stove, and she heated water, and she prepared the food she and Owen would need for the work of the day, which she was already understanding would not be the ordinary work of maintenance, but something else, something the situation was going to determine and that she was going to need to be ready for. Owen ate beside her without speaking. He had spoken, she thought, perhaps 20 words since the night he had said her name and told her she knew what to do. But the 20 words were different in quality from his months of silence, because they came from presence rather than absence, came from a man who was in the room rather than a man who was somewhere inside himself with the door shut. He ate, and he looked at her over the rim of the tin cup, and his eyes asked the question that he had not put into words. She told him what she was thinking. He nodded. He did not speak, but the nod carried what a speech would have carried: the full registration of what she was saying, the understanding of what it meant for the day ahead, and for the resources they had, and for the decisions that would need to be made. He put the cup down and stood up and went to begin the work of clearing the entrance and assessing what the storm had left. They spent the first hours of the morning doing the work of after the work that followed 7 days of confinement. The animals were checked and found to have come through better than she might have hoped. The cave's consistent temperature having given them what the fields outside would not have. The water barrel had a good level. The firewood supply had been managed carefully enough that there was adequate reserve. She walked through the systems with the attention of someone conducting an audit, confirming that what she had built had done what she had built it to do. It had. She thought about her grandmother. She thought about the journal which was on the shelf in the cabin where she always kept it. She did not need to go and read it this morning. She knew what it said. She knew it the way she knew the dimensions of the cave, and the sound the water barrel made when it was half full, and the particular quality of light that came through the entrance in the early afternoon on a clear day. She had read it so many times and lived it so completely across the summer and the fall and the winter that it had stopped being something outside her and had become something inside her, had become the same kind of knowledge as the knowledge in her hands. Not retrieved, but simply present when it was needed. The first figure appeared at mid-morning. She saw it from the entrance, a dark shape moving against the white of the valley below, moving in the slow, effortful way of someone traveling through deep snow, moving toward the mesa. Then a second figure, then several more coming from different directions, converging on the mesa from the valley with the collective deliberateness of people who have all made the same decision and are acting on it. She watched them for a while. Scout was beside her, watching too, her head slightly tilted in the way she held it when she was processing information she had not yet categorized. They came from town, and from the ranches and from the outlying properties along the valley. People she recognized as the figures grew closer. People who had bundled themselves in every layer available, and were nonetheless moving with the labored caution of people for whom the environment had become actively hostile. There were children among them, small shapes held close to larger shapes, and older people who moved more slowly, and who were being helped through the worst of the drifts. There were 22 of them. She counted as they came. Marcus Tully from the general store, his face gaunt from a week of reduced rations and the specific stress of watching the stores he had always considered adequate turn out to be inadequate against the scale of what had come. A family she recognized as the Pelham family who farmed the bottomland east of town. The parents with 3 children between them. The children's cheeks red from the cold, and their eyes wide with the particular expression of children who have had an experience too large for their current framework. Reverend Whitaker, the minister who had delivered a sermon in October about the proper channels through which Providence delivered assistance to the deserving, and who was now making his way through the snow on Nora's Mesa with the expression of a man who has been revising certain positions. The Cullum brothers from the livery who had been the most vocal laughers at the auction in May, who were now arriving with their hats literally in their hands. because hats could not be worn in this cold and had to be pressed against the chest and carried. Duncan Ferris was among them, or rather was not yet among them, arrived separately a few minutes after the main group, his 80-year-old body having made the journey from his house on the east side of town by some determination that age had not entirely managed to remove from him. He was moving slowly, but he was moving, and when he reached the base of the mesa and looked up at her, he nodded once in the way of someone who knew they were going to find what they were looking for. And then at the back of the group, the figure she had known would be there. He came last because the others had not waited for him and because he was not the kind of man who asked to join a group. He came alone on horseback, or as alone as a man can be on a horse that is struggling through 4 feet of snow, which is to say he was accompanied by his horse's suffering and by the evidence of his own, by the ice on his coat and the color of his face, and the posture of a man who has been through 7 days of something that has taken things from him he did not expect to give. Silas Vance stopped his horse at the foot of the mesa. He looked up. She looked down. The 22 people who had already arrived were at the cave entrance waiting, not crowding in because she had not yet invited them, standing in the January cold, with the patience of people who have come a long way and are trusting that the destination is what they hoped it was. Scout was at Nora's heel, not growling, not bristling, simply present and attentive. Silas Vance looked at the light coming from the cave. He looked at the smoke that was still rising from the fissure in the rock above, thin and steady, the ghost of the fire that had been burning for the better part of 8 months. He looked at the 22 people standing in the cold, and then he looked at the woman who was making the decision about what happened next. He said what he said. He said it quietly in the voice of a man who has used up most of what he had. "May we come here?" She looked at him. She looked at him for the time it took to breathe in and breathe out. She was not making a decision in that interval. She had made the decision before he arrived, had made it in the abstract when she had seen the first figures coming across the valley and understood what the situation was going to require of her. The interval was something else, a moment of acknowledgement, of standing in the full weight of what had been and what was before turning toward what was necessary. She said to bring them in. She said it clearly to the full group, her voice carrying in the still January air without effort. She said the cave was large enough for everyone. They came in. She organized them with the efficiency of someone who had been thinking about exactly this situation since the first figure appeared on the valley floor below. She directed people to positions in the main chamber that would keep the most vulnerable away from the entrance and close to the heat source of the cabin stove. She sent Owen to the sheep pen area with the children, because children do better with animals to focus on, and because Owen had the quality with children that quiet people sometimes have, the quality of a presence that does not demand anything, that simply provides steadiness. She directed the older people to the cabin itself, where the warmth was most concentrated, where the floor was even, and the draft was minimal. Marcus Tully tried to say something when he came in, some preamble to an apology or an explanation that she could see forming on his face. She told him to go to the left side of the main chamber and to help the families with children arrange their space, and he went. Reverend Whitaker stood for a moment at the entrance of the cave with the expression of a man who is revising a sermon in real time, looking at the sheep pen and the water system and the cabin with its smoking chimney and the organized stores along the walls, looking at all of it with the eyes of someone who has said something from a pulpit that this place was in the process of refuting. She did not wait for him. She directed him to the right side of the chamber, and he went. Silas Vance was the last one in. He stood just inside the entrance and looked around, the way a man looks when he is trying to comprehend a space that contradicts everything he has said about it for 8 months. His eyes moved over the sheep pen, solid and full and functioning, the animals inside it, alive and healthy. His eyes moved over the water system, the gutters in the tin, and the barrel that was holding the moisture. The limestone had been giving up all winter. His eyes moved over the cabin, the small but sound structure with its stovepipe vanishing into the ceiling with the warmth it was putting out even through its walls. He stood there for a long time, just taking it in. She let him. She had things to do, and she did them, moving through the organized space of people and needs, with the competence of a woman who had been managing complicated situations her whole adult life and who had built this particular space for exactly this kind of management. She distributed the food with the precise calculation of someone who knows the supply and knows the number of people and has done the arithmetic. She heated water and sent it around. She checked on the older people in the cabin and on the children with Owen. The day settled into the rhythm of a managed emergency. People who had arrived exhausted and frightened and deeply uncertain about their situation began to recover slowly. The particular recovery that happens when warmth and food are restored to a body that has been without them. Children fell asleep against their parents in the cave's interior. The older people in the cabin began to talk quietly, the talk of people who have come through something and are beginning to recognize that they have come through it. Duncan Ferris sat against the cave wall near the water barrel and watched everything with his 80 years of watching things. He said nothing and he watched everything. And occasionally he met Nora's eyes when she passed, and he nodded in the way of someone confirming a view he had held for some time. That first evening, Nora fed them from what she had. She had prepared for a 2-person winter, which meant her stores were not designed for 24 people. But she had prepared carefully, and she had prepared for longer than she expected to need. And the result was that she had a reserve not generous but real. And she fed 24 people from it with the calm precision of someone managing a budget that requires attention, but is not in crisis. She sat up late that night when the others were sleeping or nearly sleeping, and she worked through the arithmetic of what she had and what she needed and how long they would need to be here. The road out of the valley would require days or weeks to become passable, depending on the weather that followed the storm and the resources available to clear it. She made her calculations, and she found that the calculations were uncomfortable but not impossible, that with careful management she could maintain these 24 people for long enough. And she began to plan the management. She was at this work, sitting near the low lamp with the journal open beside her for reference, when she heard a step behind her. She did not turn immediately. She had learned over the months to read footsteps, to know from the rhythm and weight who was moving through the cave. And the footsteps behind her now were Silas Vance's footsteps, slower and heavier than the others, the footsteps of a large man who is moving carefully and who is not sure he has the right to be where he is. She waited. He came around to where she could see him without turning, and he stood there, not close, a respectful distance. And he looked at her work and at the journal beside her. He looked at the journal for a moment in the way of someone looking at a thing they have seen before and are seeing in a different context. He sat down. He did not sit across from her in the way of someone prepared to conduct a negotiation. He sat beside her, which was not a gesture of familiarity, but a gesture of equality of two people who are going to talk honestly rather than strategically. And the choosing of that position said something about what he intended before he said anything. She waited. He said he had lost 300 head of cattle. He said it the way people say large numbers when the large number is attached to a large loss. Not for shock or sympathy, but as a statement of what had happened that required saying. He said the north barn had collapsed under the weight of the snow on the fourth night, that they had gotten most of the horses out, and not all of them. He said 2 of his men he had employed for years and knew as well as he knew anyone in his life had died in the attempt to save the cattle before the barn went down, had gone into the storm and not come back. He said their names. He said them quietly, the names of 2 men, and he looked at the cave floor while he said them in the way of someone who has been carrying those names since the moment they were lost. She listened. He said his wife, meaning a woman who had come to stay with him before the storm. A cousin of his wife who had been visiting from Billings and had been caught. There was ill from the cold that had gotten into her lungs, and that the doctor, when there was a doctor available, would say was pneumonia, and that he did not know if she would recover. She listened. He was quiet for a while after saying these things. The cave around them was the cave at 2 in the morning with 22 people sleeping in it, and the fire low and the water dripping and the animals quiet in their pen. The lamp put a small circle of light on the floor between them. He said her name. Not the way he had said it at the entrance, not the exhausted, formal address of a man who has come to ask for something. He said it the way a person says a name when they are beginning something they have been preparing to begin for a long time. When the name is the way they are choosing to start. He said that there was something he needed to say, that he should have said a very long time ago. She looked at him. He looked at the floor. He had the specific quality of a person in the process of setting down something heavy, not quickly and not easily, but with the deliberateness of someone who has decided that the carrying is no longer justified by whatever it was serving. He said, the year of 1851. He said it, and then he stopped for a moment long enough for that year to fill the space it needed, to fill the year that was 40 years ago when they were both young, and the valley was younger, and the world had a different shape than it had now. He said that in 1851, in early December, she had told him there was a storm coming. She had come to him 2 years a wife to his brother, 23 years old, and she had said what she had read in the sky and in the animals and what her mother's knowledge told her those signs meant. She had said there was a storm coming that was going to be worse than anything they had prepared for, and that the cattle needed to be brought in. He stopped. He said he had been 32 years old. He had been a rancher's son and then a rancher. And he had been a man, in the particular sense of a man, in that time and place, who has not yet been wrong about anything important, and who has not yet had reason to question the categories he uses to assess who is worth listening to. About what? He had looked at this young woman who had come into the family from somewhere else, and he had heard what she said, and he had decided without examining the decision that she was not a person whose reading of the sky required his serious consideration. He had been wrong. The storm had come exactly as she had said it would. He had lost 50 head of cattle that had been in the east pasture because he had not brought them in. He had lost them, and he had stood in the field looking at the frozen animals in the field, and he had felt the specific feeling of a man who has been wrong in a way that has consequences, and that feeling had needed somewhere to go, and he had sent it in her direction. He had told Robert that she had made him anxious about the weather, unnecessarily. He had said it in a way that made Robert's wife the cause of the loss, rather than his own failure to act. He had said it in front of Robert and in front of others, and he had said it with enough conviction and with enough authority that the version became the one that persisted. He said he had told this story for 40 years. He said he had told it so many times that there had been periods when he had almost believed it himself, had almost successfully relocated the origin of the event from his own failure of judgment to her unnecessary interference. He said he had been almost successful at this. He said the word, almost. He said that when she had come to the auction in May and raised her hand for this land, he had felt something that he had spent 8 months trying to identify and had finally identified as fear. Not of her. Fear of what she was doing, which was the thing that people do when they refuse to disappear after being wrong about. Which is that they go on, they continue, they persist in existing as themselves. And by persisting, they keep alive the possibility that someone will eventually understand what actually happened. He said he had sent someone to cut her fence in September. He said this flatly without preamble, the confession of an action delivered in the same tone as the confession of a belief. Because both were things he was responsible for, and both required the same accounting. He said he had sent a man he trusted to go to the cave at night and damage the pen she was building. He had wanted her to fail. He had wanted her to fail in the specific and visible way that would confirm the story he had been telling for 40 years, the story in which she was a woman who did not understand what she was doing and had no business trying. He looked up from the floor. He said that she had not failed. He said it with the simplicity of someone stating a fact that has been established beyond argument. The way you state a fact about the physical world, about the temperature of the air, or the depth of the snow. She had not failed. The thing she had built was here around him, holding 24 people through the worst winter in 40 years. Because she had known things that he had spent 40 years pretending she did not know. He reached into his coat. He took out a small cloth folded and held it in his palm for a moment before opening it. Inside was a ring, a plain gold band worn smooth and slightly thinner than it had been when it was made, the band of a ring that has been on a hand for many years. He held it out, the ring in the center of his palm open. He said Robert had given it to him in February. Robert had known by February that the winter was going to take him. And he had given Silas this ring, which had been their mother's ring, which was the ring that should have gone to Robert's wife as a matter of the family's ordinary inheritance and custom. He had asked Silas to give it to Nora. Silas said he had not given it to her in April, when he came with the papers. He said he had not given it to her in May when she bought the land. He said he had held it for 8 months. And during those 8 months, he had told himself various things about why the time had not yet been right, why there would be a better occasion, why the current circumstances were not conducive. He said he understood that these were the explanations of a man who could not bring himself to perform the action that would require him to look at her as someone he had wronged, rather than as a problem he was managing. He said he was sorry. He said those 2 words in the voice of a man for whom those 2 words cost the price of 40 years of a story he had told himself about himself. The price of being the kind of person who says those words and means them to someone he had worked very hard to believe did not deserve them. The lamp between them was very low. Nora looked at the ring in his open hand. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about Robert, about his face in February when she understood what the winter was going to take, about the 42 years of a marriage that had been a good marriage by any measure she knew how to apply. She thought about the ring and the woman who had worn it before Robert's mother, who had come west with it from somewhere else. And she thought about what it meant to pass a thing down through generations, to carry something forward through time, by choosing to hold it and not let it go. She reached out and took the ring, not as forgiveness. She did not say the word forgiveness, and she did not perform the gesture of forgiveness, did not reach for his hand or look at him with the expression of a woman releasing something. She took the ring because it was Robert's mother's ring, and Robert had wanted her to have it. And these 2 facts were sufficient and complete. and did not require Silas Vance's 40 years of history, or her 40 years of receiving the effects of it to be true. She closed her hand around the ring. She looked at him. She said that the management of the food supply was going to require some decisions, and that she would need his help with the distribution logistics in the morning, because he knew the families better than she did, and knew whose situations were most acute. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man receiving a response that is not the response he expected, but that he recognizes as more than he deserves. He said he would be there. The days that followed were the days of the aftermath, the long, unglamorous work of a community coming through something. People began to go back in small groups once the snow had settled enough to allow movement back to the town and the ranches and the damaged structures and the work of assessing what remained. They went gradually over the course of 5 days, the healthier ones first, and those who needed more recovery staying longer. And the cave shrank back toward its ordinary population as they left, not all at once and not without the particular exchanges that happen when people leave a place that has kept them alive. Marcus Tully stood at the cave entrance on the morning he left and said he had been a fool at the auction, and he knew it. He said it without the elaborate performance that some apologies require. Said it directly and then turned and went, and she let him go without loading the exchange with anything more than it needed to carry. The Reverend stood in the entrance for a longer moment. He said that he had been wrong in some specific ways, and he intended to think carefully about which ways. She said that seemed like a good use of his time, and he accepted this with the grace of a man who has learned something recent and is still in the process of knowing what to do with it. Duncan Ferris left on the 3rd day, having recovered the warmth he needed, and having assessed the situation with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who wants to understand what he has seen before he leaves the place where he saw it. At the entrance, he looked at her and he said in the particular accent that 50 years in Montana had not fully claimed that her grandmother would have recognized this place. He said it as the highest compliment in his register, and she received it as such. Silas Vance stayed until the 5th day. He was not intrusive. He occupied his designated area in the main chamber, and he helped with the distribution of supplies and the management of the space with the efficiency of someone who had spent his whole life in the practical management of large operations and had those skills available to him even when everything else was stripped away. He did not address her directly except in the matter of practical coordination, and she did not address him except in the same manner, and this was the right level of engagement for the circumstances. On the morning of the 5th day, he was the last one left besides her and Owen. He stood at the entrance ready to go, his horse waiting outside in the cold, and he looked back into the cave one last time. He looked at the sheep pen and the water system and the cabin with its faint curl of smoke still rising above, and he looked at all of it with the eyes of a man who is committing something to memory. He said that he had told people for 40 years that this land was worthless. She did not respond. He said he had been wrong about that too. He left. She stood at the entrance and watched him go down the track toward the valley, a smaller figure than the one who had ridden up 8 months ago with the papers on his brother's kitchen table. Smaller in the way of people who have set things down and find that setting things down changes their profile, reduces them in one way while opening them in another. Scout was beside her. She put her hand on the dog's head and stood there until Silas Vance had become a small shape against the white of the valley, and then a smaller shape and then indistinguishable from the landscape. Spring came to the Montana Valley the way it always came, reluctantly in stages. The snow retreating upslope week by week until the valley floor showed the first brown patches of ground, and the creek began to move again, and the birds returned from wherever they had been during the months the birds were not there. It came, and Nora watched it from the cave entrance each morning the way she watched all things from the cave entrance now, with the particular quality of attention she had developed across the months of building this place. The attention of someone who belongs to the place they are watching from. She did not leave. There had never been a serious question of whether she would leave. The cave was hers. The land was hers by deed, and now by every other measure. And the life she had built in it was a life that had proven itself in the test, that the winter had provided a test more thorough and more demanding than anything she could have designed. She had prepared for that test, and she had passed it, and the place she had prepared in had held her, and everything she put in it, through the worst that the season could offer. She was not going to leave it. Owen stayed too. He had never been asked to stay, had never been asked about his plans, and he had never spoken about them. He had simply been there, and continued to be there. And as the spring came on and the days lengthened, he was more there than he had been. More Owen in the full sense of the word. More capable of the small daily exchanges that are the texture of life lived with another person. He was not recovered, if recovered was the right word, for what happens when a person comes back from grief. She was not sure recovered was the right word. He was present, and he was useful. And he had begun to speak in sentences when sentences were what the situation required, and occasionally when the situation was the right kind of situation. He said things that were not required, but that he wanted to say. She listened to those things with the specific attention they deserved, which was the attention of a woman who had kept a space open for her brother's voice for 10 months and was not going to stop noticing it now that it had returned. In April, the people came to learn. It began with a woman from the bottomland, the wife of one of the Pelham family who had come back to the cave after the storm, and asked if Nora would show her the water system, specifically the method of identifying the right quality of limestone wall and building the gutter structure to harvest what it offered. Nora showed her. A week later, the woman came back with her husband and 2 of the neighbors, and Nora showed them all. Then Marcus Tully came not for supplies, but to ask about the stove, about the principle of connecting a fire to a natural fissure, how you identified a suitable fissure, and how you built the connection that would draw rather than backdraft. She explained it. She used her grandmother's diagrams, and she used the specific fissure above her head as the example, pointing out the features that had made it viable and describing the test she had used to confirm the draw before she built the permanent connection. She began to keep a record of what she was teaching. She took the journal, which still had pages remaining at the back, pages her grandmother had left blank, perhaps knowing that a granddaughter would need them, and she began to write in them. She wrote in a different hand than her grandmother's, a larger, less compressed hand. The hand of a woman who has room to say what she needs to say and does not need to economize. She wrote what she had learned from the journal, and she wrote what she had learned beyond the journal, what the cave itself had taught her across the months of building and living and the winter of the test. She wrote about the cougar and the skillet, which her grandmother had not written about, because her grandmother had not experienced it. And she described the principle that the experience had demonstrated, which was the acoustic amplification property of limestone caverns and its application to the discouragement of large predators. She wrote it with the precision her grandmother had modeled, with the specific detail that would allow someone else to use the principle without having been there when it was derived. She wrote about the sheep, and the night of the 5th day, the night she had looked at the sick animal and found that the journal was not sufficient and had needed to make the judgment herself. She wrote about what she had noticed and what she had thought, and what she had decided, and what had resulted not as a narrative but as a case record, the kind of careful documentation that would be useful to someone who encountered the same situation and needed a reference point. She wrote carefully, and she wrote fully, the way her grandmother had written, the way of a woman who believes that knowledge is only worth keeping if it is kept accurately, if it is given to the next person in the form that will allow the next person to use it. She was writing in the journal one evening in late April, when Owen came to sit beside her. He looked at the page she was writing on, and he looked at the pages that came before it, and at the older pages in his grandmother's hand, and at the drawings in the margins that their mother had pointed out to them both when they were children. And the journal had been a family heirloom rather than a working document. He said it was good. He said it quietly, which was how he said most things now, but with the conviction of someone who means what they say, without requiring it to be large. She said she thought there were things her grandmother would have written about if she had known what Montana was going to need, and that it seemed reasonable to write them now. Owen said that their grandmother would have written them herself if she had been here. He said it with the small precision of someone who has thought about the lineage clearly and understands what is being continued. She looked at him. She thought about how long his voice had been absent and how different the cave felt with it in it. How the cave had always been the right size for the work she was doing in it. But how it was also the right size now for two people to live in it. Not crowded, but occupied in the way of a space that is being used for its intended purpose. The ring was on her hand. She had put it on the morning after Silas gave it to her, and she had worn it since without examining the gesture too closely, because it was not a gesture that required examination. It was the right ring for the right hand. A thing restored to its proper place after a period of misdirection, and wearing it felt like the ordinary correction of an ordinary error, no more and no less than what it was. She finished the page she was writing. Outside the cave entrance, which was open now that the season had turned, the valley below was doing what it does in April, which is producing the first tentative green against the brown of the surviving grass. The first announcement of the color that would come back and cover everything that the winter had left bare. The creek was audible from the entrance, running with the volume of the snowmelt the accumulated winter released in the movement of water, finding the way down. The mountain above them was still wide at the upper elevation, but was losing it. The snow line retreating toward the peaks day by day, with the slow certainty of a season that knows it has won the argument. She closed the journal. Scout was at the entrance, lying in the strip of afternoon sun that reached the cave floor when the angle was right, her gray muzzle resting on her paws, her eyes half open, monitoring the entrance with the half attention of an old dog in a place she trusts. The sheep behind them made their small sounds. The water dripped. Nora sat with the closed journal in her hands, and she thought about her grandmother in Cornwall, sitting in a stone house above the Atlantic with her own journal, and her own knowledge and the same conviction about what was worth keeping and why. She thought about her mother who had carried the journal from one side of the world to the other, in the belief that the other side of the world was going to need what was in it. She thought about the woman at the auction who had sat in the back of the room in a plain dark dress, with $20 and a dog and a brother who was not speaking, and had raised her hand. She thought about the winter. She thought about Owen's voice in the dark of the fifth night. She thought about Silas Vance at the cave entrance in January, 3 words, the cost of saying them visible in every line of his face. She put the journal on the shelf beside the lamp. She got up and went to the entrance and stood where she could see the whole of the valley, spread out below her in the April afternoon. The green that was coming back, and the brown that it was replacing, and the white that was retreating, and the dark lines of the timber stands, and the thin line of smoke still coming from the chimney of the Vance Ranch on the far side of the valley. A fire still burning over there. A man still occupying the house. A situation that was not resolved but was changed. That was not repaired but was different from what it had been. Different in the way that things are different after they have been spoken about honestly for the first time. Scout came to stand beside her. She put her hand on the dog's head. The valley held its spring light for another hour before the sun moved behind the western ridge and the shadow came across it in its patient daily progression. And she stood there for most of that hour. The woman and the dog looking at the world from the place where they belonged to it.